So I thought is there's two ways that I would go about talking about this, which is number one, Kubrick's what we know view of the occult, and then secondly, how that's been used to approach Kubrick's films, three in particular. So I'll try and keep this quick. I don't know how much biographical information you want or need, but Kubrick's born, well, appropriate enough, today is his birthday in 1928. And he passed away at the age of 70 in 1999. And I really like the description on the website of this talk. Occult means occluded, hidden from view. It denotes a world of mystery and esoteric knowledge hidden in plain sight, a world that only divulges its secrets to those who speak the secret language of symbols. Well, in many ways, this is very apt for Stanley Kubrick. What we know about Stanley Kubrick, I would like to think until our biography came out, was a world of mystery and esoteric knowledge, not always hidden in plain sight, and that we've had to delve beneath the surface. I really like that description in the introduction of Kubrick as an iceberg. And hopefully we've shown you some of more of what's floating beneath the surface. And so in a sense, just even looking at Stanley Kubrick as a figure fits into that definition of the occult. I mean, secondly, and this is part of what I want to deal with, is there's something really interesting about the figure of Stanley Kubrick. Um, Kubrick's, and maybe I'll deal with the second bit first, that I mentioned at the beginning. The way Kubrick is approached as a filmmaker, I think almost sets him apart from many others. It's not even how he approached his films that sets him apart from many others. It's how fans in particular and others, particularly since he died, have looked at his work, and they've treated it as if itself is a form of mystery and esoteric knowledge, um, a world that only divulges its secrets to those who speak the secret language of symbols. So, and people have been mining his films, in particular, probably 2001, The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut, for secret language, which I'll talk more about. And there's something about Kubrick as the figure that lends itself to this. He's been described as notoriously reclusive. He's very elusive. He shut himself away in his house. He was hermetic. He kept himself apart from the world. I mean, none of that's true. He was open to the world. It's just the world came to Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick didn't go to the world. But that whole kind of mythology that surrounded him lends itself to this view that this is an esoteric director. Added to that, he's bearded. He cuts this rabbinic figure. Many people through his life, and we describe this in the book, have described him as looking like a rabbi, particularly when he started to grow a beard around the making of 2001 in the mid to late 60s. And he was Jewish, which at the heart of many theories, Jewishness is at the core of those. So that lends itself to this idea of Kubrick as this Talmudic figure putting secret language into his films. And really, what from actual true life, Kubrick was a fan of codes and code breaking. One of his favorite books, according to his longtime assistant Anthony Fruin, was David Kahn's The Code Breakers, the story of secret writing. And this is how Fruin described the book: 1,000 pages plus on the history of codes and ciphers, written in engaging and direct style that left no stone unturned. Stanley Kubrick saw this as one of the great works of the 20th century historical scholarship. So it's no stretch, therefore, to believe that Kubrick used any knowledge gained on cryptography in his films, and particularly in the ones that I mentioned, 2001, The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut. He also compared his role as a director to that of a detective looking for clues. So in a sense, Kubrick himself, when we know this, sets himself up as this director where nothing we see we should take for granted. And what also lends itself to this sort of occultish view is that Kubrick refused to explain the meanings of his films. Occasionally little bits drip through, but what he wanted to do was to present us with the images and the words and give us the materials with which to think, but he didn't tell us how to think. And I think there's something in that kind of in that elliptical elusiveness that lends his film to us being able to interpret them in multiple different ways. So there is something, first off, very interesting about the figure of Kubrick. I mean, I'm open to challenges on this one, but I can't think of very many other directors that are subject to the kind of critical, I'm not going to say scholarship, but examination that one can find on YouTube, for example, or on the internet, that really sort of takes his films apart and assumes this kind of authorial intention, even with the errors, and then tries to find hidden meanings as a result of that. So that's kind of number one is Kubrick, the figure of Kubrick. So apart from what I've just told you, what do we know about what Kubrick believed in aspects that fall under the kind of definition of the occult? So I've mentioned cryptography and secret language. One of the things I'm very keen to, I mean, to look at in his work is the influence of Jewish occult knowledge, mystical knowledge, as in Kabbalah, and how that influenced Stanley Kubrick. Now, I can't say for certain that Kubrick, you know, I don't have anything where, in particular, where Kubrick has mentioned this, but one can assume that around the time he's making 2001, which is really his most mystical film, the works of the Kabbalist Gershom Scholem, the most famous Kabbalist, are being translated into English and popularized in the United States round about the time that he's working on 2001. And 2001 is really interesting because he hires two guys to work on the kind of AI side of things. Irving John Good, who worked on the Enigma, cracking the Enigma codes during World War II, and then Marvin Minsky, who was a professor of artificial intelligence at MIT. Now, both of those individuals, both Jewish incidentally, claimed descent from the Maharal of Prague. And the Maharal of Prague is the rabbi who's credited with creating the most famous golem in history. So the golem, as I'm sure you're aware, is this what's the word, humanoid made out of clay, which, when activated with the secret word, comes to life. And then when one of the letters of that secret word is erased, so it's when Emet, which is the Hebrew for truth, is inscribed on his forehead, he comes to life, or it comes to life. And then when the Aleph of Emet is erased, it becomes Met, which is death, and the golem is deactivated. And the golem, again, the golem's interesting because the Maharal of Prague is a Kabbalist, and he's using strings of letters or numbers, because Hebrew letters are also numbers, Aleph being one, and so on, to create artificial life, right? Which is essentially what Marvin Minsky's doing, and Jack Good, as modern Kabbalists. They're creating a form of life from strings of numbers. So, programmers, in a sense, modern Kabbalists. Now, that idea of the golem runs throughout 2001, in the form of HAL, in particular, this piece of technology that runs amok, which is essentially the moral of the story of the golem story, is technology run amok. The rabbi creates the golem to look after the Jews of Prague, but in the end, he loses control of his creation, and that becomes a metaphor for technology, science, and war in particular. So Frankenstein's the most famous kind of version of the golem story. And incidentally, the golem, man, probably know this, became really popular during World War One, when war itself and the technology of war was perceived as a golem. And many soldiers, in the publication of Gustav Meyrink's The Golem during World War One, it was very popular because they perceived themselves as men of clay, literally, because they're covered in mud in the trenches. So there's all these interesting connections. So if we go back to 2001, with 2001, we have this supercomputer HAL that runs amok and kills all but one of the crew. And sorry, dog's interrupting me there, but that's very appropriate because Stanley Kubrick loved loved animals, and they were always interrupting his work. And when Gershom Scholem named the first computer in Israel, he called it Golem. So we see that connection there between computers, golems, Kabbalah, technology. And we can see that idea of golems running through Kubrick's subsequent work. Alex in A Clockwork Orange is this, the idea of A Clockwork Orange is like a cyborg, like that we see in Terminator. A clockwork interior covered by an organic exterior. And the programming of Alex in 2001 turns him into what I like to call Halix, a combination of Hal and Alex, this kind of programmed organism. The Marines of Full Metal Jacket are referred to as Mother Green and her lean, mean killing machine, suggesting a cross-fertilization of automaton and clay, as in Mother Earth, from which the golem was formed. And Jack, now we're moving on to The Shining, acts as a virtual golem in The Shining, created from flesh, but activated and automated to do the hotel's murderous bidding. Here, Jack would be more akin to the golem in the 1920 film. There were various adaptations of the movie in the 20s, and there's one that survives, Paul Wegener's The Golem, 1920. Now, interestingly, The Shining is probably the film that one might look at that lends itself most directly to occult readings, in the idea that, it's a ghost story. There's a lot to do with the paranormal. I would say Kubrick's film is more psychological than it is supernatural, but the paranormal is definitely part of the film, especially the US cut as opposed to the European version. And there's this idea of The Shining. So Danny, Halloran and Danny's parents, it's revealed, can see events long in the past that they didn't witness or into the future. And they can talk to each other without speaking. And in interview, and I'll quote here, because this is, it's always rare to get Kubrick to say something directly about his films, but he's told Michel Simon, "I've always been interested in ESP and the paranormal. In addition to the scientific experiments which have been conducted, suggesting that we are just short of conclusive proof of its existence, I'm sure we've all had the experience of opening a book at the exact page we're looking for, or thinking of a friend a moment before they ring on a telephone." He then goes on to say that, so I said he's always been interested in the topic, and he gives an example with one of his cats. I just talked about his pets, where I'll quote here: "I think I can see behavior in animals which strongly suggests something like ESP. I have a long-haired cat named Polly who regularly gets knots in her coat, which I have to comb or scissor out. She hates this, and on dozens of occasions while I've been stroking her and thinking that the knots have got bad enough to do something about them, she's suddenly dived under the bed before I've made the slightest move to get a comb or scissors. I've obviously considered the possibility that she can tell when I plan to use the comb because of some special way I'll fill the knots when I've decided to comb them. But I'm quite sure that isn't how she does it. She almost always has knots, and I stroke innumerable times every day, but it's only when I have actually decided to do something about them that she ever runs away and hides." So now, that's what you think of that, but that's a direct example of Kubrick talking about the paranormal and ESP, extrasensory perception. And throughout the film of The Shining, we do have these elements of Danny being able to sense events that have happened and are about to happen, and you know, uh, and ghosts in the hotel. Now, interestingly, towards the end of the film, and this is one of the rare things, I haven't got the exact quote. Kubrick did an interview with a Japanese director where he said, yeah, I do think there are ghosts in The Shining, and that therefore this is quite optimistic because it means we don't, there's life after death. So that's quite an optimistic thing that we still carry on. But he did admit that there was that the film dealt with the idea of reincarnation, and because for those of you who remember the very end of the film, uh, there's a photograph on the wall, and it's dated 1921, and at the center of this photograph is Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance, the caretaker, suggesting that he's always been the caretaker. And that somehow he's reincarnated, and that this is a sort of endless loop of reincarnation. And he said as much to a Japanese director. And I think it's really interesting. So if we go back to 2001, we see the idea of reincarnation at the end of that movie. So as Dave Bowman, who's the only astronaut to survive Hal's murderous rampage aboard the Discovery, um, that Dave goes through the Stargate. He then arrives in this kind of alien room that's mocked up to look like a room on Earth, but it's not it's quite uncanny. It's not quite right. Again, all these Freudian theories of the uncanny run through Kubrick's work, with The Shining in particular, which he actually read in preparation for writing The Shining, as well as a lot of Gothic novels. With a professor of Gothic literature at Berkeley, who co-wrote the screenplay, Diane Johnson. And at the end of the movie, for those of you, sorry, here's a spoiler if you haven't seen it, but it'd be amazing even if you haven't seen it, you don't know this is what happens. Dave Bowman reincarnates into this star child, this baby. And turns out in the novel it's a baby with superhuman powers, like this kind of Nietzschean Superman. That's less explained in the novel and in the film. You just have to infer that for yourself. And many people take it, some people refer to it as the second coming of Christ, this child. But at least it points to the idea of reincarnation. Or one of the things I find interesting is the term he uses is the term in Hebrew for reincarnation is Gilgul, and Gilgul is translated is the title that's given to Kafka's Metamorphosis when that's translated into Yiddish, de Gilgul, the Metamorphosis. So these themes are closely interlinked. So one can see these metamorphoses also throughout Kubrick's work, as in Alex and A Clockwork Orange, Jack in The Shining, in particular. And the word Gilgul, as the root, is related to the word Golgelet, which means skull, hence Golgotha in English, for the place where Jesus was crucified. And for those of you who know 2001, there's a little hint there about what's to come, one could argue, in that the beginning of the film, when Moonwatcher, in that Dawn of Man sequence, learns to use a bone as a weapon, we see an animal skull and foregrounded on the floor, and all those bones around him suggest Ezekiel's the dry bones that in Ezekiel, which also points to the resurrection of the dead, which is another idea in Jewish mystical thought. So, can I prove Kubrick put any of it in there? No, but Kubrick's well versed in many things, and at the point that he's making 2001, and then later The Shining, but particularly 2001, is when mystical ideas are really entering American counterculture. That's the point at which things like Zen Buddhism and yoga and ideas from the East are really beginning to influence Western culture for the first time. And Jews, as part of their own religion, are turning towards mystical explanations in Kabbalah. So that's, as I said, Gershom Scholem's works are being translated. That's also becoming more popular. And Kubrick, is someone who's a very zeitgeist director, I wouldn't be, is plugged into what's going on around him, and wouldn't be surprised that this material isn't influencing, consciously or otherwise. So whilst I've done this whole Kabbalistic reading, it was in my previous book, Stanley Kubrick, New Jewish Intellectual, 2018, I called the chapter on 2001 Kubrick and Kabbalah. So I've done a whole Kabbalistic reading of 2001. My argument was, this isn't such a stretch, because he's a Jewish director, whatever that means. Like, he knew he was Jewish. I wouldn't say he made Jewish films, though I think he did, but not in, say, the explicit, obvious way. But he's part of a culture in which mystical ideas are influencing people like Allen Ginsberg and Michael Hare. Ginsberg, at Columbia. Hare, he collaborates on in with Full Metal Jacket. So it's not a stretch, I think, to and that's part of what I tried to do, is to put Kubrick in his intellectual cultural context and say, well, what's going on around him? What did he read? And therefore, is it a stretch to say that some of this might have seeped in his films when we know that he's immersed in these ideas and these debates? Now, just for the last few minutes, and then I'll take up to about half an hour, I'll go to the final film. So the film, I mean, it's very difficult to pick loads of stills from this movie, but the film that's really, I think, lends itself to kind of the readings, to occultish readings, um, is Eyes Wide Shut. And there was a very nice bit in, and I really like this description from, I mean, it's your description, Watkins' books description. I cannot take credit for this, but I liked it, so I'm going to quote it. So here's a quote from the website. His films mostly take place in liminal, dreamlike settings where nothing is ever as it seems, and where strange subconscious forces loom just below the surface, bleeding through the mundane and subverting it completely. Now we do see hints of that from his earliest films onwards. Fear and Desire takes place in the landscape of the mind, and the fog kind of codes that. Lita opens with this foggy setting on Grim Road that gives a suggestion of a fairy tale, mythical, not quite, real place. Um, The Shining is very, has a dreamlike logic in a way, in that we never quite know what's real, what's not real. The structural impossibilities of the hotel, the fact that Jack knew what was going to be around every corner, suggests a dreamlike logic, or maybe that this is all taking place inside his head. That's my favorite theory. And then this really plays through with Eyes Wide Shut, which, given the oxymoronic title, Eyes Wide Shut, or to go back to its German title, Traumnovelle, dream novel, or Rhapsody, a dream novel that's translated into English, suggests this whole thing is just a dream. So hence the kind of oniric, dreamlike quality of the movie, and that things don't quite seem real, don't quite seem realistic. The New York that's recreated in London isn't meant to be an exact replica of New York. I mean, Kubrick loved accuracy, he loved realistic details, but he ditched them where he said, real is good, interesting is better. So he ditched them in favor of interesting where necessary. But there's a kind of dreamlike quality to the look of the movie, the push processing that gives that kind of grainy effect, all those lights. And it's interesting, I just had an exchange with someone. I hadn't noticed a lot of details, but the jazz club scene in Eyes Wide Shut, there's a sequence where he said nothing about that sequence rings true, and this guy deconstructed a whole load of points about what was wrong with the jazz club sequence, a very important sequence in the film, because without that, Bill does not gain the knowledge or the password to go to the orgy, which is kind of at the heart of the film and probably at the heart of the occultish readings of the movie. So there's the fact that things don't quite ring true, and also the dreamlike logic of the movie, in the sense of the repetitions. There's the first half of the movie that is repeated in the second half. And that goes back to Clockwork Orange. The first half of the Clockwork Orange is repeated in the second half, where things happen to Alex that didn't, in a different way than happened in the first. And this happens to Bill as he repeats his Odyssey. So that idea of uncannies and doubles and dreamlike logic really enters this film, particularly. And then at the heart of this orgy sequence with this masked, robed figure. People have compared to Torquemada presiding over this quote unquote satanic ritual. He's swinging an incense censer. There's a chair inscribed with symbols. You can be Googling the stuff to have a look if you don't know, which some people have said refer to the Rothschilds. And there's everybody's masked, and there's very scantily clad women who then participate in various sex acts among the um, among the attendees. And many people have pointed to this as a sort of secret sex cult, And we do know that when Kubrick was researching this, he researched loads of, Kubrick famously did loads of pre-production research. And one of the books in his, in his collection that he read for this was Brooke Smith's Cult and Occult. He read loads about sex in late 19th, early 20th century Vienna. He read books like Edward Bulwer Lytton's Zanoni, about an immortal Rosicrucian brother who falls in love and loses his power, a strange story, a man of science who confronts the supernatural and is humbled. He was interested in Foucault's pendulum and adapting that. So all this stuff is kind of entering his consciousness. So most people have read Eyes Wide Shut as pointing to some secret sex cult that Kubrick's giving us prior knowledge of. I mean, more troublingly, it's said that Kubrick was prophetic and warning us of the predations of Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, and others, and those in power. And it's not a stretch then for that to lead to some of the accusations of QAnon later on. That I'm not saying Kubrick was a QAnoner, but the idea of secret knowledge being hidden in a film, warning us about sex cults, has been read in Eyes Wide Shut, and as well as loads of symbolism. There's different symbols throughout the film. There's a star at Victor Ziegler's apartment in the beginning, a pentacle that's been read in particular ways. The appearance and reappearance of different characters at the party and at the end. At the end in Hamlet's toy, well, it's shot in Hamlet's, but it's set in FAO Schwartz. There's the board game with the magic circle, which lends itself to these readings. And then the idea of circle is a prominent iconic device in Kubrick's work, circular and circularity, circular motifs, as well as circular structures. Waltzes are circular. And in a way, the magic circle also refers back to the circle that we see at the orgy, which is the centerpiece of the movie, where this, as I said, this red robed figure presides over this this kind of this ritual, with the semi naked women, and that Bill is just an observer to all of this, as he's the wanderer on his own Odyssey, which an Odyssey is also circular, hence why we call the book Kubrick an Odyssey. On his Odyssey when he eventually returns home. So okay, so just to bring this all together to wrap up for half an hour, we know Kubrick had an interest in the supernatural and the paranormal and the occult, and he read loads of stuff, whether it was for movies or his own interest. Some of that did enter his films, deliberately, probably most notably The Shining. But I also think, as I said, through the ideas of the Golem and Kabbalah, particularly in 2001 onwards, and Eyes Wide Shut. But there's something about the details, the way Kubrick made his films and presented them to the world, as well as himself, that allows people to engage in these kinds of readings as well, to reveal the hidden knowledge in Kubrick's work. So hopefully that's given you some food for thought, to ask some questions or disagree on whatever. And thank you for your attention. I'm gonna have to look up this. So just to be perfectly honest, I'm gonna have to look up this. I think you as an audience will know more about Andrew Chumley than I will, so I don't want to. I don't want to try it on here. So thanks for that. I will look up more. But to kind of reflect on some of the comments you then just added, my host just added, is yeah, I mean, sitting in a cinema in a dark place, comfortable place, and having stories. My daughter, when she was young, called dreams the stories in her eyes. So I love that description. She actually used it in that. With Bob and I did a 2019 book all about Eyes Wide Shut, and so the very act of sitting in a cinema is like the act of dreaming, and many people have made that comparison. It's like Plato's cave, for example. And yeah, there is that idea that Kubrick is the master magician giving us images. beyond our ken, right? There's a book I really love that I don't know if anyone's read that I suppose would fit in with this. It's called Flicker by Theodore Roszak. Theodore Roszak, you familiar with this? He's the guy who coined the term counterculture, and he wrote this novel about this theory that this secret group were inserting subliminal images into movies, and it's a great read. And Kubrick was interested in subliminal messaging. I think 70s when he was reading about that at its peak. And it is really tempting to think of him as this kind of master magician manipulating us. I mean, I'll just give you an example from his films. Ziegler says to Bill Harford in that billiard sequence at the end of Eyes Wide Shut, "Suppose I told you the whole thing was staged," right? And I like to read that sequence. Is what we've got here is older Kubrick and younger Kubrick. You know, this is an autobiographical film. Bill Harford's the ingenue Kubrick getting involved in the film industry in the 50s, and Ziegler's the wizened, hardened director of the 90s, looking back at himself. And he's saying, supposing I told you the whole thing was staged. Well, Kubrick's been staging since his first photograph, which was staged in 1945. So we do know he was a master of psychological manipulation and misdirection. And it's really tempting to think of him as that figure and putting subliminal messages in his movie. But I don't want to go down there and say that he's manipulating us in some kind of, because it often goes off in a way that's like never good. What I do want to suggest, and I don't know if that's answering a question, it probably isn't, but so I apologize. But what I like to think is Kubrick did stage everything, put these ideas in front of us, but at least then didn't tell us directly what they meant. So we then can come with it with our own interpretations. And I think his films are elliptical enough that you know, we all come out with something slightly different. One of the beauties of teaching Kubrick, which I've been doing for 18 years now, is every time I teach it, my students can point to something new and come out different, you know, or people I talk to in talks like this come up with something different and something new. And so I don't want to call that subliminal messaging, because subliminal messaging, in a way, is there to direct you to think a certain way. And now, if Kubrick's doing that, I don't think he's very successful at it, precisely because we all come out with slightly different interpretations, is the point I'm getting to. So if that's what he's aiming to do, he's failed. But the films are rich enough, filled full of messages, that we can read it in particular ways. But I don't think he's directing us as directly as Ziegler admits that he is to Bill. Yeah, I mean, I think appearance lends itself to that. You know, this bearded, reclusive figure. Yeah, it's interesting because the French auteur theorists talk about the camera stylo, you know, the camera pen, and I like that. And my students talk about the idea of the camera baton, you know, as a conductor. And I like your idea of the camera wand. Yeah, there is a lot of manipulation involved in. I mean, when we're watching a movie, we're watching manipulation, right? It's an obvious point. You know, we're not. So I sat through The Shining with two of the editors, and at certain points, one of them would turn to me and go, "You see all that? That's all lights. That's not daylight. That's lights." And you're like, "Oh yeah," but as you're getting into the world of the film, you're not there going, "Oh, well, that's just a 1,000-watt bulb shining through the window. That's not real light." You kind of are not aware of the manipulation. Like Jack when he freezes to death in the snow. That's not snow; it's salt. Right? The hedge isn't a real hedge; it's just branches nailed to some wooden boards painted to look like they've got snow on them. Right? So yeah, there is that whole manipulation, and I think there were two things: the serendipity and the manipulation go together. So Kubrick manipulates his actors in certain ways. I mean, there's loads on this, right? There's the way that he treated them psychologically to get the performances he wanted. I mean, most famously Shelley Duvall, um, but not just Shelley Duvall, many of them, right? There was the psychological misdirection, manipulation, as well as the psychological misdirection of the audiences. Yes, he tried to control every element of in the set, so there's no element of chance in a way a magician might. But was extremely open to those serendipitous movements that he didn't plan for, often because he didn't know what he wanted until it was given to him. And that's why he would push and push people till he didn't know what he wanted until someone gave it to him. And then he'd go, yeah, that's what I wanted all along, but I just didn't know it when I started. So it's that kind of controlled environment, but to allow for those serendipitous moments. But I think the thing that's most like The Magician is for Kubrick, it doesn't matter what the screenplay says, it doesn't matter what he had in his head. It's what it looks like on the monitor when you're shooting. So everything's subordinated to the image. And if it doesn't look right, it goes. Even if he planned it and planned it and planned it. That's why he never storyboarded. If you look through Kubrick's archive, which I've done a lot of, there's almost no storyboarding. There's a little bit in some shots for The Shining, Barry Lyndon, because Kubrick didn't want it planned out in the way that Hitchcock would plan it out. He wanted to see what it looked like on the monitor, and only once he'd seen it on the monitor would he know whether it was right or not. And I think, as you were speaking, that's the closest that I think of, um, Kubrick and his wand and the camera. But for him, the sensuous part of it wasn't the cameras himself, which is interesting for a cameraman, right? I mean, he started off as a photographer, and by the end of his career, he wasn't shooting it except for the very end when he had to. Which is, I think, part of the reason why Eyes Wide Shut killed him, because of the physical exhaustion of working on the movie. Is the bit he loved. For him, when you talked about the sensuousness, it was editing. So it was actually the celluloid, the feel of the celluloid. That for him, I mean, for me, whenever I teach this stuff, I say the one bit that distinguishes film as an art from any other art is editing, right? Yeah, you can edit a book. Yeah, you can sort of change a painting, but the story gets constructed in the editing suite, and that's the bit he loved. He can shut himself away. He hated shooting. He loved pre-production, hated shooting, loved post-production. He could shut him away with his editors, and that's where the story came together. And I think that bit where you described sensuousness, that's where I think he felt sensuous. Was the celluloid and then stitching it together and getting it just right. And he was brutal and ruthless there, right? So yeah, he might have shot all that footage, but if what didn't fit the story, didn't look good, it went. But he needed to have the range of available choices in front of him, right? You couldn't just have two takes and I have to use the best one of that. If you had 7 or 8 good takes, and bear in mind, that's why two reasons why he pushed all his actors again and again. Sorry, this is getting off on one, but he pushed all his actors again and again. Was A, they needed to know their lines, and as they were scripted that day, and if they didn't know them, then that was no good. And B, they then had to deliver them correctly, with no technical glitches. For less technical glitches, things that interfere with the shot, and that was just your baseline. So you have to have them delivered right with no technical glitches. But then he wanted something interesting. Yeah, he said, I need something interesting. So he'd push and push his actors. They got to a point they were so annoyed with him, they might give him something much more interesting than they'd planned. So that's why you have multiple takes. So you put that in the editing room, and that's when I think the real manipulation comes about, the real sleight of hand. I mean, literally, because he's in the old days, you're literally actually having to splice the stuff, right? And editing's where the manipulation really comes in movies, isn't it? Not just the creation of the set. So Eyes Wide Shut, apart from a few shots, the entire thing is shot in London, pretty much, or just outside. So there's a manipulation there, and then there's the manipulation of the story, and then there's the manipulation of the actual celluloid and the lighting, and then the push processing. I could go on, but yeah, and where you stitch the bits of the story together. I mean, so there's an interesting shot if you rewatch Eyes Wide Shut. You've got Alice with a dress on, and she lets the dress fall off her onto the floor, and she's there naked back to the camera, and then we go to the next sequence. She's then wearing a different dress in the bathroom, and we've then got to consider what in that stitching together of those shots, which weren't shot chronologically, right? What is the relationship between them? And we then have to work that out, right? And that's the beauty of Kubrick as a director, is the explanation isn't given, and actually there's lots of such a small shot you blink and miss it. But for those of us who look at this stuff with that obsessiveness that I mentioned at the outset, we're like, "Oh, what does this mean?" And very few directors, I won't watch a Christopher Nolan film and go, "Oh, what does this mean? He must have meant something more." But with Kubrick, you do it, right? And in that piecing together those shots, you're like, "Well, what does this mean? Is this where the dream begins? Is this Alice's dream? Is this her trying on dresses before she selects the one?" There's all these for what is a literally several second shot. And people have freeze framed this and then looked, well, what are the two tennis rackets? What do they mean? I could go on, right? And they obsessively parse the shot and look for the details. And that was another thing. Sorry, just years of research pouring out here, so I'll shut up on this point in case you got more questions. Is Kubrick didn't care about continuity either. Like, I was told by one of his continuity guys, Kubrick didn't give up for continuity, and you see it particularly in The Shining, where chairs appear and disappear, and this really then lends itself to those readings, those esoteric readings of what did he mean by that? He must have meant something. Whereas, well, Kubrick was like, well, this is not important, you know, but that's not a satisfactory answer, so we ignore that and we look for the meanings. No, I 100% agree. I mean, just in the preamble when you asked me about biography, I 100% agree. So for me, one of the things I did in my 2018 book, Stanley Kubrick, New York Jewish Intellectual, was to try and look through what I'd call them the Kubrick avatars in the movie, who's standing in for Kubrick in his films, but particularly with his later films, his maturer films. Um, and, uh, we begin to see identification with characters, I'd say particularly with Clockwork Orange, where just all the violence in the film, where Kubrick, I think, really did. I'm not saying that. Oh, this might be my reading of it, or it is my reading of it, but I think my interpretation of that, Kubrick says the greatest violence is the violence the state does to Alex in taking away his free will, because it's that free will, that spark that allows Alex to create, right? And that's the spark that Kubrick has as a creator. So there's a story back in during the making of 2001 where he wouldn't take drugs when Michael, who's he with, Roman Polanski and Dan Richter, who played Moonwatcher, said, they said, Kubrick, you ever taken drugs? He said, no, because I don't know what the source of my creativity is. And I'm afraid that if I take drugs, it will interfere with or take it away. And I think, and we see that played out in Clockwork Orange. But I think the three most autobiographical movies are The Shining, Barry Lyndon, and Eyes Wide Shut. And so I 100% agree with you. What for me is, yes, he very much identifies with this failed writer, because Kubrick himself was a failed writer, um, with Jack. And for me, it's a Freudian. Uh, that long 3-minute opening shot traveling up a mountain, right, isn't about just showing us that Jack's traveling up to a high place. It's about that this is a Freudian introspective journey into the mind, right? And we've got to consider that Kubrick's dad was called Jack, right? And yeah, I want to go, but that's the Stephen King novel. He kept the names from the novel. Yeah, he did, but he discarded stuff when it didn't suit him or he couldn't do it. So there's no topiary animals, there's no fire hoses that come alive, the boiler doesn't explode, the Volkswagen's yellow, not red. He'll change those things. And he kept Jack, um, in there. So I think there's something very autobiographical about that. So I read that movie I think it's a Freudian auto introspective case study, and that's why Jack knows where everything is, because it's in his head, right? Um, Barry Lyndon's also really autobiographical. Like Stanley identifies with Barry, the social climbing foreigner in English society is exactly what Kubrick was, right? And getting rejected. One could say Kubrick wasn't rejected, but he never quite felt 100% at home, because not only was he Jewish in a kind of anti-Semitic England, but he was married to someone German as well. And we think of the nativism both in the States and the UK that's anti-German, you know, in the period, it might in the period in which he was sort of creating up until the 90s. And then, Eyes Wide Shut's the most autobiographical, because what Kubrick has done is taken the place of his birth and overlaid it with the place of his death, which is London. So he's created this mythical New York in London. And there's some slippage, because you can see at points, if you watch the movie, there's a bit where Bill's driving on the wrong side of the road and we see the back of a sign because he's on the wrong side of a road, right? And there's the bit shot in Hatton Garden where you look closely, yeah, it's Hatton Garden, right? And you can, the actual shops. He's changed a few of the signs, but not many of them. And so, yeah, I totally agree with you that in the search for the hidden, perhaps we miss what's right there. That I think any work of art by any creator is, we were talking about Spielberg earlier, is by definition autobiographical, because intentionally or otherwise it's going to be in there, in that positionality. Um, yes, all those other creative voices can come into it, because it's a collaborative medium, and not everything in the film was Kubrick's intention or his doing, but the ultimate cut with a Kubrick film is, right. So if it stays in, it's because he wants it in there. And really interestingly, so just I mentioned Cedric Duval earlier. If you take making of The Shining, the documentary his daughter shot, right, whilst making The Shining, which is often painted as an unvarnished window into the truth of Kubrick, well, he edited it. So even then, it's not unvarnished. It's mediated. It's him giving us a view of him that he wants us to see. But apparently, the miscalculation he made was he didn't realize, I think, how people would use it after he died. He just wanted to sell the film. So he showed all the interesting bits to sell The Shining, because he saw it as an extended trailer for The Shining. What we now get is this thing, well, there's a master manipulator showing us the view of us he wants us to see, and it's all misdirection. Or it's people saying, no, it's an unvarnished window into the truth of what Kubrick was really like. So the thing is with Kubrick, what I find really interesting is it depends how you start out looking at him. This is true of the scholars, the fans, the critics, everybody, right? One of the reviews we got was really horrible. It's in the New York Times, and it was quite clear we never get a good review because the person who asked to review it didn't like Kubrick. It's all right. So if you don't like Kubrick, you'll find all the evidence you want to sustain your view. And if you do like Kubrick, you'll find all the evidence you want to sustain your view, right? And I think our interpretations say more about us, right, than they do about him. And my reading in the 2018 book was a Jewish reading, but it was deliberately Jewish, right? To say simply, I'm Jewish, Kubrick was Jewish, I'm going to try and read it from the milieu he knew, not your one, right? Because lots of people impose readings on him that, why would he make a Christian film in 2001? He wasn't, he was agnostic. So certainly if he's going to do a religion, he's going to do the religion he rejected, that he knew and rejected, not the one that he didn't know anything about, right? Um, and I was trying to say to people, look, I am in a way imposing my own reading, but I'm not trying to say it's the only one. I'm just adding. But the backlash I got was quite clear that they didn't, I could see that they didn't like that reading because it wasn't theirs, because they wanted to impose theirs on it. So with Kubrick, it's almost like the monolith, right? Dark space. You look into it, and what it reflects back at you what you want to get out of it, right? There's nothing written on that monolith, so you can tell it. You can tell us whatever you want. It's a movie screen. It's the Ten Commandments without words. It's an ancient standing stone in a high place that we see littered through Canaanite, the Canaanite Near East. Um, these are all different things but in the end, we'll never quite know what he meant. Yeah, that's an interesting. I'll have to look more into that one. Again, just one thing I forgot to mention, if you to think about the Kabbalistic symbolism at the end of 2001, there's the smashing of the glass, right? The breaking of the vessels at the end of when Dave Bowman drops his glass on the floor. And uh, I like to think of it as the glass. I mean, Arthur C. Clarke said it, actually, the glass that gets smashed at a Jewish wedding, But one could think about the breaking of the vessels in Kabbalistic symbolism. I think the fact that there are 13 films are highly symbolic, whether that was intentional. I mean, that, as you were saying, it's an obvious one, isn't it? And 13 in Jewish symbolism is obviously a good number. Um, and and as you were talking, what came to me was about the idea of numbers that run through Kubrick's work. Is there are lots of recurrences of numbers, and particularly sevens, which has their own sort of mystical properties in Judaism and Kabbalistic thought. And Jeffrey Cox, who wrote a book called The Wolf at the Door, says Kubrick always wanted to make a film about the Holocaust, but never did. But the film he ended up making about the Holocaust was The Shining, and he uses sevens as proof of that, because 6 times 7 is 42, and 42 is the date of Hitler's final solution. I mean, it's a bit more sophisticated than that, but that's in essence. But there are these numerical, this goes back to the Kabbalistic idea and Sphirot and all this, that there are these numeric recurrences and coincidences that run through the film that that allow us to read into it, right? Um, and I think we, I started to do it. Let's look at the sevens and think of it from a Jewish point of view, and let's look at what other digits there are and what they add up to. And then I don't know if you're familiar with the Torah code, the Bible codes, where I bought one the other day because it had Stanley Kubrick in the index, and I thought, oh, that'd be interesting. Unfortunately, the Bible didn't predict Stanley Kubrick. I would have loved that. They just made a comparison. You can do that with Kubrick's films, and I think the numbers, um, you know, the 13 films that you mentioned, we like to think this might have been deliberate, although I don't think it was. Kubrick had many more films he wanted to do but didn't get to make, often through no choice of his own. What we end up is the 13 that he did. But I think it says a lot about the power and the mythos of Kubrick. And I agree with the person who put a comment in the chat that said, I think Kubrick played with his own mythology. I 100% agree. I think he did have a hand in sort of trying to manipulate that, but it got out of control, like any golem. But it says a lot about this mythology that we can think of him in that way, and we don't do it with others. There's definitely, I think, Kubrick trying to invent himself over the years as well in his dealings with the press, particularly early on, and I think he is trying to create his own image. Unfortunately, it kind of goes wrong because it goes places where I don't think he wanted it to. So even he can dominate that. And one of the things that he really never understood was the British tabloid press, and particularly after Clockwork Orange. So however much he wanted to create his own mythos, it didn't ever quite work. But he did try, and I think he had more success in the United States um, than here in the UK. Yeah, I mean, my favorite story about the moon landings is Kubrick was asked to fake the moon landings, but being the perfectionist, he insisted on shooting it on location. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know when it started. That's a great question. I'd have to look into, like, when did this all begin to begin to emerge. But I think for me, it's the figure that he cuts, right? If you want to have a conspiracy theory, right, having someone Jewish, unfortunately, if you look at the heart of most conspiracy theories, ultimately there's usually someone Jewish at the heart of them, so that helps. As I said, this sort of bearded rabbinic Talmudic closed, esoteric, reclusive, hermetic, whatever word you want to use, director really builds the image. And the fact that he was really smart, he was a chess player, a grandmaster sort of level brain, it helps build the mythology. The fact that he's into secret codes. I mean, the best comparison I give is someone who followed the career of Leo Strauss. I wrote an article about him years ago. That Leo Strauss was described as the eminence grise behind the second George W. Bush administration and the war in Iraq. And we're like, well, why is this long dead philosopher being resurrected to suddenly become the brains behind the war in Iraq? And then it's like, well, because many of the neoconservatives in the administration read him, right? But then you look at the figure of Leo Strauss, he was like, they was described as having a cult of students who studied at his feet, and also Jewish, and who put secret codes in his work. And it's like, well, he just lent. You're looking for a conspiracy. He cut the figure that you need at the heart of the conspiracy, right? This Ziegler, and I think Kubrick fulfills a similar role. There's something about him that gives credence to the conspiracy theories, that other directors just can't take seriously in that respect, right? Um, and I can only think it's the fact that he created what the Earth looked like from the moon, before anyone had seen it and had been to the moon so accurately, that made people think probably in the 70s, through the era of paranoia conspiracy, and and you think of all the Alan J. Pakula theories and Watergate, that maybe he did have a hand in that, because he did it. How did he get it so right? And that was the thing. He was very good at getting things right because he did the research. Like the interior of the B-52 bomber in Doctor Strangelove was so accurate that the US Air Force thought there'd been a leak. And he's like, no, we looked at your own magazines, recreated it. So that eye for detail, accuracy, it wasn't just him. He hired the right people, Ken Adam, Joy Seddon, in 2001. But he also had, Werner von Braun advising him, and had Werner von Braun's Harry Langer and Frederick Ordway, and like I said, Minsky. Good. He got the right people in. So yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I'd have to think, when did those conspiracies first start? Um, I know they were popularized with that documentary Room 237 about The Shining. No, that's a good question. That's a great question. I mean, the archive is huge, and if I wasn't specifically looking for something, you know, I d there will be a lot of stuff I've missed, right? I'm just gonna have to be quite honest about that. But the archive, like the monolith, will reflect back at you what you want it to. So if you are looking for that, it could be there. Like you say, it's Kubrick had many, many projects of varying levels of interest, right? That he engaged in, whether they were just he liked the initial idea and it went no further, or he actually did some work on the screenplay, or he got into pre-production, right? So the most famous Napoleon AI Aryan papers. So it is quite possible it's there. I didn't come across it, but then again, he is reading around the subject for Eyes Wide Shut, so he might have well have read Aleister Crowley. Just whether it extended beyond that, I couldn't tell you. But the Kubrick archives are open to anybody to go. You have to make an appointment, and they are open to anybody to go have a look, and have a look to see if the evidence is there. Well, at one point, I don't think I hold it. I had the record for the researcher who'd spent the most time in there. Um, yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, it can be very frustrating depending on one level, because, as I said, you're confronted with this huge amount of it. And there's even more. They put more in recently. Um, you have to make selective decisions, and again, I think I start with, you don't find you very rarely find the answer for something you're looking for written down on a piece of paper, right? Desperate to find the answer. Once I did, um, you know, uh, um, again, the archive's almost what you make of it, because there's so much material there. I think what is really interesting, most scholars just go and look at a particular film, right? Or of very few go film by film. And when people do go film by film, they also miss that that's not how Kubrick's life worked. So there are, I'm not saying he didn't do it simply because I didn't know. I don't know. I just don't know. I'm agnostic on this question, not right. I just don't know. Um, uh, uh, the one thing that is interesting, he was really interested in 19th, early 20th century Vienna, in parts of the Traumnovelle. So the sex, the chess, all that. For me, that's the frame. Freud. That's the frame in which he was viewing it. But knowing him, he probably would have read around. I wouldn't be surprised if he read about Aleister Crowley, whether he wanted to go as far to make a film. So the main thing for Kubrick making his film was, did he fall in love with the story, right? And two, was it doable, right? Could he make it? Is it filmable? So many things would get discarded no matter how much he was interested in it, because well, he might have been in love with it, but it wasn't filmable, or it's filmable, but he wasn't in love with it. I think it's both. I think there's what he would have read Like the only book that we get the word occult in the title is with reference to Eyes Wide Shut, right? Um, so there's what he's working on for specific movies, like is he working on Full Metal Jacket and read loads on Vietnam? But then there's also the um, um, I think just he was a wide reader, so I think he would have, if interesting, he would have read about it, and I think he probably would have read around this subject. Um, and a lot of his books are in the archive, but not all of them are. So take the example that I've written quite a bit about is Aryan Papers, his Holocaust movie. So there's this whole load of books on the Holocaust which have all been branded under the Aryan Papers, and I think he just read those anyway. It just got more intensive when he was making a movie. So I'd say the same thing for Eyes Wide Shut. He probably read around the topic, like Watkins books type books, but it just got more intensive when he was doing Eyes Wide Shut for those specific needs. Because he's quite voracious, um, and quite Catholic with a small c in his tastes. So I think the answer's both. I don't know. It's probably only interesting to me. Who knows? It's interesting to know. So, just the example of the one time I found something, an answer to something I wanted proven, and it's very personal to me. Is as I was looking through the notes to confirm that Kate Blanchett did the voiceover for the mysterious woman who saves Bill at the end of the orgy, um, which I'd heard that. I got confirmation. I found the napkin, the thing with her scribblings on, right? In that folder was a piece of paper, instructions to dubbers and translators describing Victor Ziegler, hedge fund manager, about 50, Jewish. And I was like, yes. I was like, we've long assumed he's a Jewish character played by Sidney Pollack. He's full of all the stereotypes. Make that of what you will, right? Here I have proof, right? Now, for me, that was a big thing because I've written these books on Kubrick is a Jewish director. Whether that surprises or is interesting to anyone else, not so sure. So for me, that was the one moment, uh, um, that I can think of right now. And I bet if you ask me in a few days' time, and I'd say something else. I'm just going off the top of my head. Um, I think the other interesting thing is just the amount of ephemera he kept. Right? You really get a sense of a human being by the crap they keep, and he was a hoarder. And this included the camp magazine that he was the photographer for back from 1944, right? When he was a kid, taking photography for his summer camp. So you really, you build up little details. Oh yeah, he got done for speeding once in the 50s, which is interesting because people say he never drove over 30 miles an hour. That's one of the myths about him. So, yeah, I don't know if that's going to change the world or anyone's view here, but it's those little things that humanize, and you're just always amazed to try and find something that no one else has found. There's loads of us looking at this topic, and we all want to find the thing that no one else has found. So, and some of them the world is interested in, and some of them only we're interested in. And I'd put that thing about Ziegler being the latter. I don't know how many other people are that keen to find out Ziegler is meant to be Jewish, but I was.